Okay, great. Let's talk about composting today. Happy spring, everybody. I think I can finally say that. Thanks for joining us. I'm not sure that that was an appropriate statement given this past week's weather, although we desperately needed the moisture. But we're going to be talking about backyard composting today. And some of you may be active composters that you're already doing this. Some of you might be thinking about starting a compost pile for the first time. In either situation, that's great. And in a year in which we're talking about water conservation, adding organic matter, soil amendments to our gardens is very, very important. And composting is a great way that we can do that and also recycle some of the organic debris that we're collecting from our kitchens and collecting from our yards and gardens to achieve that goal. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. I'm going to kind of talk about the process. So there are several steps to this process. We're going to go through each of these steps, and then probably towards the end, if there aren't any glaring questions, we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end. This presentation won't probably take more than about 45 minutes or so. So lots of time for questions at the end. All right, so first I want to just discuss what soil is, our garden soil is, and what role organic matter plays within that broader ecosystem. Soil is a combination of a lot of things. It's a combination of weathered rock. So this is what we call our parent material. This is the sand, silt, and clay fractions. Air is a very important component of soil. Water, and then organic matter. And organic matter can come from a lot of different places. It can come from plant roots. It can come from micro and macroorganisms that have died and are decomposing within the soil environment. Or it can come from different sorts of organic amendments that we're adding. We call this fraction humus, which is when we have organic matter that is rapidly decomposing within the soil profile. And compost is one of the ways that we can be adding that to our soil. So just as a reminder here, very important for us to think about, and this is going to have relation as well when we talk about composting. When we think about an ideal soil by volume, this is kind of what we're looking at here in Utah. About 45% of the soil is made up of the sand, silt, and clay fraction. Remember, that's the weathered bedrock. About 5% is organic matter. We typically have to add organic matter to our soil to achieve that 5% level. I have seen organic matter fractions as high as maybe 8% in soil samples that are sent in through the soil testing lab, but 5 to 8% for a garden soil, especially for vegetable gardening, is really a pretty good target, a pretty good goal. Naturally, our soils here in Utah are at 1% or less. So typically we do have to add organic matter or compost to our soils to get up to that 5% range. If you have never amended your garden soil before, if you're starting a brand new garden area, and you want to build those organic matter levels, then what we would recommend is adding about 2 to 4 inches of a well-composted organic matter material. That can be a store-bought material, or that can be compost that you're making at home as well. That you add that and incorporate it into the soil. To maintain levels from year to year, you need to add about 1 to 2 inches of a well-composted organic matter material. So that's kind of the amounts that we're talking about. We find a lot of times actually gardeners overdo it. You really don't want to be in a position where you're adding, 6 or 8 inches of compost and trying to turn it into your garden soil. You can create some problems that way. Actually, that is directly related to the composting process that we'll talk about here in a minute. So don't overdo it. 2 to 4 inches if you're trying to build those levels, 1 to 2 inches annually if you're trying to maintain those levels. But very important. We also have.
Katie, I've got a question if you got a
Yes,
second.
Sure.
With the vegetable gardens that you've seen that are organically managed, have you seen them tend to have issues with too much organic material in the soil?
Yeah, sometimes, yes. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation as well. But what we can find sometimes is, especially if gardeners are adding a lot of compost or soil amendment that's high in carbon-rich materials, then we can sometimes have a large carbon load. And as we'll learn here about composting in a minute, in the decomposition process of organic matter, bacteria are utilizing nitrogen. So what we can find sometimes are nitrogen-starved systems when gardeners are overdoing it with too much carbon-rich materials that they're applying via compost. So that's why you kind of want to be careful that you're not overdoing it in one application. That 2 to 4 inches, if you're just starting a new garden for the first time, and then 1 to 2 inches annually is about the right level that's going to help you to be in the safe zone in terms of providing what you need to provide, but not overdoing it.
Sounds great. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, and then very importantly here, you see that air and water fraction. A lot of times people are kind of surprised by this. Soils should be about 25% air and 25% water. So really half of the soil space is void space. It might be voids or macropores that are filled with water or that are filled with air. And obviously these levels are going to fluctuate as different sort of environmental conditions arise, whether maybe it's after an irrigation event or after a rainstorm, or the soil has had a chance to dry out. So those levels are kind of going to kind of ebb and flow, but we really want to maintain about 50% of the soil environment in void space. Now, if we are watering too often, too frequently, too much, if we're watering wet soil, by the way, sprinklers should not be on right now, especially given our drought conditions. If you've turned your irrigation system on, turn it off. We're not ready to irrigate yet. We still have quite a bit of moisture in our soils. If you are adding water too frequently, then that 25% water is going to start to increase. It's going to work its way into that 25% air fraction, and that is not healthy for plant root development. It's also not healthy for macroorganisms and microorganisms in the soil, including the bacteria that we need to break down organic matter. So you want to make sure that you kind of maintain those levels. Give you kind of a tactile, and this is actually, by the way, the same for composting, to give you kind of a tactile kind of a no pun intended feel of what that feels like in the soil. It feels like a wrung out sponge. So if you were to completely saturate out a sponge with water, pull that sponge out of the water, you can have water just dripping down from that sponge. That's too much, but you wring it out and you lay it in your hand and you can feel that there's moisture there, but you also know there's air in that sponge. That is about that 25% air, 25% water level. So just a little tip as well. That's exactly the same moisture level that we're trying to maintain in a compost pile as well. So you can kind of feel for what is right. Okay, so what is compost? Compost is dark brown, humus-rich material that results from the decomposition of organic matter. And we'll talk about different sources of organic matter here in a minute. It occurs with the aid of invertebrate macroorganisms and microorganisms. So microorganisms are things that you cannot see with the naked eye. You do need a microscope. So it's a community, right, of these different organisms and this organic matter. Obviously, the organisms are there because the organic matter is their food source. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. So you're really trying to foster a thriving ecosystem of things you can't see. So there are other indicators to us that decomposition is happening. And again, we'll talk about that as we move through the composting process. What are some of the benefits of compost? Well, when you add organic matter to your soil, you're going to promote diverse beneficial soil organisms. And again, you're giving these things habitat, you're giving them a food source, and so that's what's going to be drawing them in. Composting, or a decomposition of organic matter, slightly lowers soil pH. Now I have to really put heavy emphasis there on slightly. You're not going to see drastic differences, that drastic lowering of your soil pH, but the decomposition process does release acids naturally, and it will slightly lower soil pH. And we do tend to have alkaline or higher pH levels here in our garden soils and our irrigation water as well. And so we definitely don't want to raise pH. Slightly lowering is one advantage, though. It improves resistance to some fungal infestation. The organic matter in soil is, they call it a shoulder bust or breaker, in that when you're adding organic matter to your soil, you're actually adding physical things that are going to break down slowly over time in the soil environment. And in that breaking down of those, or removal of those materials over time, you create voids, create spaces in the soil. And this is what can help us to build macro pore space in our soil, which we of course so desperately need for water and air in the soil. And so it kind of busts up or breaks up the soil, you can kind of think of. That's important for clay soils. If you live closer, you live to the Jordan River or the valley bottom, yeah, you live in what was the ancient Lake Bonneville lake bottom area, you have a lot of clay and silt naturally in your soils because that's where those particles were settling. And so organic matter really works to your benefit in that it can help to bust up and break up those soils and create those air and water spaces in the soil. But organic matter is great for sandy soils as well. So the challenge with sandy soils is not so much that we have a problem with aeration or drainage, but we definitely have a big problem with moisture retention and nutrient retention in sandy soils. And organic matter does a great job of helping to retain moisture and nutrients in the soil. So for those of us that have sandier soils, we definitely want to be adding organic matter as well to improve those soil conditions. Organic matter provides a bank of slow release nutrients for plant uptake. This reduces the need for fertilizer over time. It doesn't eliminate it. I do hear sometimes gardeners saying that they add compost or organic matter to fertilize their plants. It's really a pretty slow release of nutrients. And so certainly we can be adding organic amendments around our perennial beds, around our trees, shrubs, things like that. And that's going to slowly release nutrients for them over time to help them to grow. But for an application like a vegetable garden, it's not quite as a safe bet. Usually we do still need to add some fertilizer over the growing seasons just so we can maximize the productivity out of our garden plants. But by adding compost or soil amendments, we can reduce the amount of fertilizer we need to add over time because it does provide some nutrients as well. Improves nutrient and water holding capacity of soils. We've talked about that. And just a really great way to recycle kitchen scraps, yard waste, things like that. All right, let me see if I can move to my next slide. There we go. So organic matter is the lifeblood of the soil. It is really the driver that is helping for a lot of things in the soil to function. And this is, I like to say, very much an ecosystem that we don't really want to try to manage. There are a lot of things happening below our feet when we're walking across our garden soil or walking across our landscapes. And some of the stuff out there is good, some of it's bad, so a lot of it's neutral, frankly, but it's just an all-out battle of bacteria battling bacteria and fungus battling fungus and insects battling insects. And it's just an ecosystem that the more diversity that we have, the better off we're going to be as gardeners. And organic matter is a really important part of that ecosystem. So healthy soil is balanced soil. It has life in it. Organic matter is key to improving many soil quality problems. And, you know, a little tip here in your garden soil or even in your lawn area. Sometimes people complain about earthworms. If you have earthworms in your garden, you're doing everything right. Earthworms are a great indicator of good soil health. And they also do a great job of helping for our systems to really thrive. So look at that earthworm there, just drilling that tunnel from the soil surface down to the root system of those grass plants. And you can think about how water is going to now be able to move down through that tunnel, airflow, all those different sorts of things. So yeah, sometimes they leave a few bumps and lumps on the soil surface, but just think about what it is that they're actually doing for that soil ecosystem, and they are a good indicator that you're doing everything right. You have the right moisture levels, you have good organic matter level content in the soils if you have earthworms in your soil, if you're finding those things. Okay. So we talked a little bit about how organic matter improves soil structure. Sand, silt, and clay has to be kind of glued together, lumped together into secondary particles called aggregates. This is how we get soil structure formation, and this is how we develop macropore space in the soil environment. And organic matter is key for allowing us or enabling us to do that. And it's not just the organic matter, it's also what we're going to be talking about here with composting here in just a second is the bacteria in the soil as well are really key for helping us to do that. Okay, so how does composting work? Well, what basically we have decomposition of organic matter in our soil environments naturally, right? So if we incorporate a bunch of leaves or that sort of thing into our garden soil, eventually those leaves will disappear. And it's bacteria that are and other things as well, but largely bacteria that are breaking down that material and incorporating it into the soil environment. When we build a compost pile, basically we are trying to speed up, we are trying to really energize that process, and we're trying to localize it so that we get that decomposition happening very, very quickly. And that is why we are doing it via what we're going to call active or hot composting, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But either in the soil or in your compost pile, same sort of process is happening here. The bacteria are utilizing carbon as a source of energy to keep eating, and they're using nitrogen to build proteins in the bodies to grow and reproduce. And so they need both of these things. And so when we are adding material, we are concerned about adding materials that have carbon in them, but we're also very much concerned with adding materials that have nitrogen in them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. They're obtaining energy by oxidizing organic matter, especially the carbon fraction. And so composting, you will naturally reduce the size of the materials that you started out with. So say you started out with a 3-foot tall pile of compost, then you're gonna break that material down by about 50 to 75%. So about 1 foot or 1.5 feet when you're done with the process. And really it's the water that is being that's being given off from that process, and also the carbon dioxide. And so that's one thing that happens with composting is that you will see a size reduction in the materials in which you are breaking down. The oxidation process heats up the compost pile from the ambient air temperature. So your compost pile, as you're composting, you're doing this hot or active composting, which we'll talk about here in a minute, is going to be giving off heat, and we will talk about how much in a minute. Okay. So I have alluded a couple times to the term hot composting. Hot composting is where you're putting in the work, right? Hot composting is where you're actively managing your compost pile. What do I mean by management? Well, you're aerating your pile, so you're turning it. You're making sure that you have good oxygen levels throughout the pile. Usually we recommend that with aeration, that if you're turning your pile maybe once a week, that's a pretty good range. It's okay if you have to be out of town for a couple weeks, you're going on vacation, you can't talk any of the neighborhood kids into turning your pile for you while you're gone. The composting process will slow, but as you come back and you start managing that pile again, when you've returned from your vacation and you're all relaxed and rested, then the composting process will speed back up again and will resume. You are watering your pile. And so we've already talked about what are those appropriate moisture levels in pile. It's the same as soils. Because guess what? We're trying to manage bacteria in the compost pile that is the same bacteria that we find in our soils, that is decomposing organic matter in our soils. And so it's that nice wrung out sponge, that 25% air, 25% water, kind of that magic kind of range where those bacteria are getting sufficient oxygen, but they're also at a moisture level that they like. So we're watering our pile. How often are we watering our pile? It depends. It depends on where your pile is situated, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that tactile kind of a feel for, do I have kind of good kind of moist, evenly moist conditions is really sort of the best way to make that judgment. In hot composting, it does require a little bit more effort because you do have to aerate, you do have to water, but the benefit is that you get much quicker compost. Composting is largely a summertime activity. We have much more rapid composting rates in the summertime. Compost piles will break down over winter months, but the process is really slowed through the winter with the cooler temperatures. And so if you are actively managing your pile, meaning you are aerating it, you are watering it, then you can expect finished compost in about 2 to 3 months. Really, the composting process will finish up in about 1 to 2 months under ideal conditions. So much quicker composting. Cold composting is where you're not doing anything. You're basically adding a pile of materials. You're not turning it. You're not watering it. You're just kind of leaving it to the elements. It will eventually break down, but it will take a year or more for that to happen. So it is easier, but there's but with less effort, the process is much slower. I have it here in the picture, and this isn't a requirement for composting, but a lot of gardeners like to utilize these. It's a compost thermometer, and it basically has a really long probe that can reach down to the center of the pile. Composting, especially when we're talking about hot composting, is most actively taking place in the center of the pile. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute too, but that is the temperature in which you want to be measuring. And so these compost thermometers have these really long probes that will stick down into the center of the pile. It's a great way that you can monitor the temperature over time to see what's happening with your compost pile. And that's also a great way to diagnose whether or not you're having issues, whether you are actually composting, or if there are some things that you need to do to alter your management so that you speed up that composting process. Okay, I just want to kind of make a little note here that you really don't want to be adding weed seeds or reproducing plant parts in your compost pile. What do I mean by that? Things like rhizomes or stolons, those are underground or above ground stems, some of those types of things, because with backyard composting, we don't always reach some of the higher temperature ranges or higher temperature points that industrial compost facilities like what we have at the Salt Lake landfill and some of those places are able to get to. Backyard compost pile just may not heat up to the temperature ranges needed to quote unquote cook some of our weed seeds or our pathogens in the soil. So we don't really want to be adding anything that's diseased or adding any weed seeds, because it's in a backyard compost pile, it's just not reliable that those seeds aren't going to be viable coming out of the compost process. This was just some studies that were done, and it looks at your temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, the time required to kill 90% of the seeds. Time is managed in hours. So the way you can look at this, let's look over on the right hand side at 108 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, annual sow thistle. You needed 46.5 hours to kill those seeds. So we had to be at 108 degrees Fahrenheit for 46.5 hours. If we increase that temperature a little bit to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, it only took 13.3 hours to kill those seeds. At 122 degrees Fahrenheit, it took 2.1 hours, and at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, it took less than 1 hour. Backyard compost piles, we really, for active composting, like to see temperatures around 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. But again, we may have a hard time reaching and maintaining levels at 140 degrees Fahrenheit over a substantial period of time in a backyard composting setting. So you kind of don't want to just assume that we're getting to those temperatures. And there are a lot of different variables that impact weed seed mortality: weed species, temperature, time, and moisture. Typically higher temperatures and longer duration, high temperatures increases weed seed mortality. But I love this. It just shows you what a super weed it really is. I'm kind of in admiration of field bindweed. People tend to really not like it here in Utah. It obviously is our toughest, well, maybe I'm biased, but I think it's our toughest weed that we have to try to manage here. but man, it is just such an incredibly resistant weed to just about anything you throw at it. Here we had that we needed 3-day exposure of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh, sorry, we needed 7 days exposure to 180 degrees Fahrenheit to kill field bindweed seeds, to get mortality of field bindweed seeds. There's no way you're going to get your backyard compost pile up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit for 7 days. So those things, case in point, just really shouldn't go into your compost pile. Give those to the city, to the yard waste, to put them in the trash. Don't put them in your compost pile. All right, moving on. A couple different ways that some people compost as well. This is called trench composting. A lot of times people ask me, can I just add kitchen scraps and things directly to my garden soil? We don't really recommend that. It's really better to go ahead and compost them first and then to add them to your garden soil as finished compost. But in trench composting, if you have the space available, you dig a hole in the soil, you fill it with kitchen scraps, you cover it with soil. But this is a cold composting process, right? You're not aerating these materials. You probably aren't watering them, although you could apply water. So it takes much longer. You have to wait patiently for 6 months for these materials to break down. And I find a lot of us with very limited garden spaces don't really want to sacrifice our garden space for trench composting, but some people might have that kind of area in their landscape. The other alternative is to build a compost pile. And so here are some site considerations. You want to think about a location that's near a water source. If you are doing hot composting, you are going to need to be watering your pile. And so making sure that that's going to be easy for you to get water to it is important. Part sun is best, but shade or sun are acceptable locations as well. Why is part sun best? Well, it's best because you do get sun exposure. The sun is going to help you heat up your pile. Now, remember, it's the bacteria that are rapidly producing that really is what is causing that your pile to heat up. But it is helpful to get some sun exposure to kind of get that process moving. But if you have it in full sun, then your pile is going to dry out really quickly. So those are a couple considerations there. You can compost in shade, but sometimes you do have a harder time getting that pile to heat up in those shady conditions. Part sun, we find that it's easier to maintain those moisture levels at that kind of wrung out sponge kind of moisture. So you have to water your pile less often in part sun conditions. So that's why. You can select a bin style, and there are a lot of different styles of bins. I know we'll have questions on that. Maybe I'll save that for the end about particular styles of bins. But this is one I want to just show you here. This is a 3-tier bin style and a very popular one. You can see we have 3 chambers. So that first chamber, that one on the left, is where we're putting our raw material, right? It's that second bin where we're actually actively trying to compost, right? Where we're doing our hot composting. It's that second bin where we're turning our pile, where we're watering our pile, where we're rapidly trying to break down that material. That third bin is reserved for what we call our curing stage. And this is where we have kind of our final chemical breakdown of the material, just helping the material to stabilize before it goes out to the garden soil. So that third bin is our curing bin. We're not adding new material to that curing bin. We're basically, when we've finished our hot composting, when our compost is broken down and decomposed to that black gold that we're looking for, when our pile has reduced by half in size, when it smells earthy, when there's no recognizable plant parts, nothing is slimy, odorous, or anything like that. We have just our perfect compost that's ready to go out to our compost pile. And then we put it in that third bin, that curing bin, and we let it sit for about a month before it goes out into the garden. So this is kind of a popular style for compost bins, in that it's easy to manage materials at different stages. Most of us don't have all the material that we want to compost all at the same time, and so this is a way that you can kind of continue to be adding raw materials to your raw bin. When you have enough materials to start the active composting process, you start it in your second bin, your active composting bin, and then you're leaving that compost alone after it's done composting to cure in the curing bin. You can also see too that we have some wire here that is excluding pests or things like that that might be trying to get into our piles, and so that it's good for that reason as well. So this is the 3-tier bin. Sizing wise, what kind of size do you want? The only bin that we're really concerned about in terms of size is that second bin, that active composting bin. That needs to be, for you to be able to get your temperatures up and really efficiently manage your pile, you need about a 3 by 3 by 3 to 5 by 5 by 5 size. Some people say, do I really need a raw material bin? No, you don't need one. You could just have one bin that is your active composting bin, and then do like a raw material pile to the side of it. And then as you have enough material add it to that active composting bin. But that's kind of what you're looking at size wise. The curing bin doesn't really matter either, because again, you're not actively composting. You're just kind of laying that material to the side to kind of stabilize, to finish decomposing before you're adding it to your garden soil. So hopefully that makes some sense there. Okay, what do you add to your compost pile? Well, we already kind of alluded to this earlier, but you're adding carbon-rich materials. We call these our browns, although carbon-rich materials aren't always brown. But we call them our browns, our nitrogen-rich materials, which are greens. And we'll look at examples of those here in just a minute. We're adding microorganisms. So just a little tip here. Actually, you'll go to some yard and garden stores and see compost pile inoculants. Those are absolutely unnecessary to purchase. You are going to get the bacteria you need added to your pile through either the materials that you're adding to your pile, if you're adding plants that have soil on the roots or leaves or things like that, that bacteria is automatically going to be introduced to your pile. If you really, really, really want to be sure that you're introducing the bacteria you need to decompose your pile, you can add a little bit of garden soil. And boom, you've just inoculated your pile. You don't need to purchase a store-bought product to help you to do that. We already mentioned that the pile should be about 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet to 5 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet in size. Again, this is your active composting pile. We already mentioned that you need to water your pile and aerate your pile through turning it, and wait for the pile to heat up. And if all of these conditions are right, your pile should start heating up within 1 to 2 days. It happens pretty quickly. At first, what's going to happen is you're going to have mesophilic bacteria that are heating up your pile. And mesophilic bacteria rapidly decompose organic matter, and they are really active in a temperature range of about 70 degrees to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Eventually, what's going to happen is your pile is going to continue to heat up past that range. Mesophilic bacteria can't survive in that range above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're going to start to move towards the outside of your pile. And the thermophilic bacteria are going to come into the interior of the pile, and they're going to kind of take over decomposition at the interior of the pile. And thermophilic bacteria thrive at temperatures ranging from about 113 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. You're only going to be at that 113, you're only going to be at that about 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit for about 3 to 5 days. Is what's typical. So that those temperatures don't last very long. And then after the thermophilic bacteria have come in and have helped to decompose that center of the pile, then you're going to start to see the temperatures drop again of your pile, so back into that mesophilic bacteria range. So again, remember, about 70 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They're going to continue to kind of decompose until really there's not much left for them to continue to try to break down, and that's when you have your finished compost product that you can move into the curing bin. So you're going to initially see the temperature rise again to about that 70 to 100 degree range. At some point in time, you're going to see a temperature spike drastic temperature increase into that thermophilic bacteria range, so the 120 to 140 for about 3 to 5 days, then you're going to see that temperature start to drop off again to that mesophilic bacteria range at 70 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then eventually you know that your compost is finishing up when you start to get below that 70-degree temperature range. The pile the temperature is dropping more to the ambient air temperature, and you've kind of finished up that process. That's when it's time to go ahead and move your finished compost to the curing bin. Hopefully that made some sense in terms of describing the process. Okay, carbon-rich materials. These are dry, older materials. They're things like dried leaves. A lot of us have that in the fall time. And by all means, put your compost pile together in the fall time. Composting is not as rapid over the winter months. There is some compost, some composting happening, but you can certainly prep your pile in the fall, anticipating that you're going to have really active composting happening in that pile more in the summer months. But carbon-rich materials are things like dried leaves, shredded newspaper. Be careful with paper. Paper is really, really, really high in carbon. That's why I say not any more than 10% paper. You know, maybe if you're a coffee consumer and you have your, your unbleached coffee filters that you're using and you really don't want to try to separate those out, you just want to dump those into your compost pile, then you could certainly do that, but you don't want to load your compost pile too much with paper. Straw or hay or small wood chips. Couple tips here. Things that are smaller are going to decompose faster, but sometimes super fine materials can compact and almost have build layers. So for example, if you're adding a lot of sawdust or something like that, you can kind of have a compaction layer, and that can disrupt that composting process. So, you know, not too much of one thing, right? Nice diversity in our soil ecosystems. We want nice diversity in our compost piles too. Make sure you're adding a lot of different sorts of things. Chopping things up is going to help the process to speed up. If you are adding things that are really fine, making sure that you're really thoroughly mixing those in so you don't have sort of matting layers taking place in your compost pile. Okay, so carbon-rich materials are browns. Our greens are our nitrogen-rich materials. These are fresh, moist materials. They're things like kitchen scraps. So as you're making your salad and you have your kitchen scraps, those would be considered greens. Fresh yard waste. You really actually should be returning your grass clippings into your lawn and not putting them in your compost pile. They will help to build the organic matter levels in your lawn. And we know organic matter in the soil is a great way to help to retain moisture in our soil, in our soils, which we need right now that we're moving into a drought. So mulching your grass clippings back into your lawn is what we would like to see happen. But if you do have extra grass clippings, you can add those to your compost. We do recommend that if you've done a weed and feed or something like that, maybe those are not the best grass clippings to be adding to your compost pile. You could go ahead and mulch those back into your lawn. Green leaves as well. Coffee grounds actually are really high in nitrogen as well. And if you're not a coffee consumer yourself, you can actually reach out. Sometimes coffee houses will provide old grounds to give away to people that want to take them and use them for compost. And so that's another way that you can acquire them. And manures from plant-eating animals are typically pretty high in nitrogen as well. And then, of course, fertilizers have nitrogen fertilizers, nitrogen in them. A nice organic one that works well for compost piles is blood meal. Blood meal it's a fertilizer. It's an animal byproduct. It is roughly about 12% nitrogen. So that can be added as well if you don't have as much of these nitrogen-rich materials, but you have a lot of carbon-rich materials. You can add a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer to help to get to that range in which we have good carbon to nitrogen ratios for rapid decomposition in our piles. Okay. I have been talking here for a little bit. Sean, do we have any kind of questions that we're not going to get to the latter part of the presentation.
We
Just
got
as
one
bad.
question
Yeah.
here. Can you add earthworms to soil? And where can you get them if that's something you can do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say that it's kind of one of those, if you build it, they will come scenarios. You can add earthworms to soil, but you don't need to. Kind of like you don't need to buy a inoculant to inoculate your compost pile. Earthworms are going to come in if you're adding compost. They're going to come in. They're going to come in. They are going to move in. They are going to blow in. They are going to come in from all different directions. And so, so build those appropriate soil conditions, having the high organic matter levels, the even moisture, and earthworms will move into your garden. I would say maybe I don't know, I guess you can still add it with soil amendment, but maybe raised beds might be a little bit more challenging if you're not adding things to your raised beds, if you're kind of using the same soil. I don't know where you can buy them. I've never had to buy them, to be frank with you. I've always been able to just have them naturally. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay.
Yeah. So it's mainly just supporting natural processes that will probably happen anyway, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
What do earthworms want?
Yeah.
They want organic matter to break down. So you give them organic matter breakdown. They want good moisture, even moisture levels. They want good airflow through the soil. So they want adequate oxygen in the soil. So again, I'm trying to get that 25% air, 25% water, 5% organic matter, even moisture conditions. Guess what? I've got earthworms. So yeah.
Yeah.
Questions?
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so maybe, and Sean, maybe you can kind of tell me what people are saying so I don't have to get in and out of this presentation, but this is just a little quiz for you. What can you compost, add to the compost from this pile? Or I might also say, if you were trying to make a decision about how to compost these materials, what are maybe some of the things that you would do to them prior to adding them to your compost pile? So go ahead, if you don't mind, and populate that in chat. And then Sean, maybe if you can just read off a few of those, I'd be kind of curious to know what people think.
Yep, I'll watch it. Put your answers in the chat box.
Or if you have questions or concerns about some of these materials, adding them to a compost pile, then you can populate that too, and we can talk about that. Oh, good. I've got them actually popping up in the corner of my screen. I'm seeing everything. Okay. Anybody think there's anything in there that you can't compost, or anything you should do with any of those materials prior to putting them in the compost pile?
I see no banana. I see remove staple.
Yeah, those are good. Banana, I would say you can compost that, but you definitely would want to chop it into smaller pieces.
Yeah, someone cut the banana up smaller.
Yep, exactly. Or you can make the decision to just throw away the banana peel. The citrus is another one. Citrus rinds are going to take a really, really, really long time to break down. So personally, I probably wouldn't put the citrus rinds in my compost pile, but if you did, you for sure would want to chop it up into smaller pieces. What about that eggshell? Or any issues with adding that eggshell? I hear that all the time. Can you add eggshells to compost piles?
Someone says grind the eggshells.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, we have plenty of calcium in our soil and our irrigation water naturally. It comes from the parent materials our soils were built from our irrigation water. So we don't need to add eggshells to add calcium to our compost. We don't struggle with calcium levels here in Utah, but there's no reason why you couldn't put the eggshells in there. So it'd be a way to recycle them really more than anything.
Katie,
Okay.
what would you suggest as like the most efficient way to like cut up or chop up or grind up some of these things?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I would just personally use, a nice sharp garden knife just to do that. But I'm sure maybe some other people in the class have tried other ways too that they like. Or Sean, I don't know if you have any other sort of technique that you like to do.
No, I mean, I mainly just cut them up with, I don't know, sometimes even my pruners.
Yeah, pruners, true. Yeah. Or, kitchen shears or things like that can work really
Yeah.
well. If you're adding a lot of leaf or like kind of leaf matter, either green leaves or really brown leaves too. So brown leaves in the fall time from our deciduous trees and shrubs and plants and such have a lot of carbon in them. So you do want to chop them up into small pieces before adding to your compost pile. Running them over with a mulching mower is a great way to kind of break those into smaller pieces, and then you can add them. I wouldn't really recommend adding just unmulched garden leaves. It's just going to take a long time for those things to break down, and it's not that hard to mulch them first to kind of break them up into smaller pieces and then add them. Okay, here's another picture here. Let's do the same thing. What can we compost from this picture? What materials in this picture can we compost, or what are some special considerations?
Katie, have you heard of anyone using like a food processor to break things down before they put it in the compost pile?
I have not heard that, but I would not think that that wouldn't be something that you could do.
Yeah.
I think it depends on what you're trying to break down. You know, if you are though, let's take for example these potato peels. Those are going to break down pretty quickly. You don't really necessarily need to liquidize them or that sort of a thing. You don't need to smoothie them. They're going to break down pretty quickly because they are fairly small size. So I guess I should put some relativity in what we're talking about with smaller sized materials. Okay, what are other people saying? I can't see the chat, Sean.
Yeah, let's see. No chicken.
Yes, no chicken. So chicken is as meats and greases. Even if you're cooking with oils and things like that, that's what's going to attract rodents and different vermin to your compost bin. So we don't want to add that. So that's a good one.
Someone says anything that has a plastic coating could be a problem.
Yeah, anything has a plastic coating, I would definitely agree with that for sure. Again, paper, we have to be careful with paper. Personally, I would not probably try to compost that paper cup. If I did, I would want to cut it into really tiny pieces, but I don't know. Do I really want to spend my time cutting that cup into tiny pieces, or do I want to throw it in the recycle
Yeah.
and get rid of it that way? And then with papers in general, vegetable, plant-based inks, nothing shiny or glossy or anything like that. And just be really careful with paper. Don't overdo it with paper. So anything else? Obviously that apple, we might want to chop up into smaller pieces. Sometimes I've heard people are concerned about the apple seeds not being killed in the composting process. I don't know that I would necessarily worry about that. So you don't have to take the seeds out, but
Is
kind
there
of
is there an approximate size that items should be when they're thrown into the pile?
Well, if it's really high in carbon, so wood products in particular, I wouldn't put chunks of wood in your compost pile. They would break down eventually, but it would take a really, really, really long time. So really high carbon rich materials, you definitely want to think about reducing the size of those so they compost more quickly. No, I wouldn't say that there's an ideal size. Um, uh, just think about, maybe we could say with an ideal size we could think about like those potato peels, right? That's a pretty small size material. It's going to break down pretty quickly. So that would maybe be my suggestion.
Yeah, and from our perspective at the Conservation Garden, we almost approach things in different ways depending on how fast we want something to break down or how fast we want to use an item. Like leaves can be good for compost, but we just kind of have a leaf compost pile.
Uh-huh.
And we just, when we have the time and the staff to manage it, so we just do it that way. But sometimes when we have arborists come in and cut down a tree, we'll have them shred the tree and just keep it on site. And if it's small enough, we might add it to a compost pile, or sometimes we'll just use that as mulch. So we just
Yep.
try to not let organic material leave the garden, if that makes sense.
It does. I think that does make sense, Sean. And different gardeners or different people are going to have different kind of bulks and deficits of different types of compost. If you have a pretty sizable yard, and then you're probably going to have a lot of brown material and that you're going to be wanting to try to compost leaves, brown leaves and things like that. And so you're maybe going to be interested in trying to get more greens, how you can acquire more greens. Now remember, you can always add some fertilizer. So that's a great way to do it. By the way, to give you kind of a relative amount, if you're adding, for example, that blood meal, for a 3x3x3 to 5x5x5 compost pile, you're thinking about adding maybe, if you've got a lot of, carbon rich leaves and not a lot of nitrogen, maybe about 15 or so cups of blood meal is about the quantity of what it is that you're looking to add. But then for apartment dwellers, they're going to have a lot of kitchen scraps, but maybe not as much of the browns. And so they're thinking, gosh, how can I offset, or how can I get, some of those browns mixed in? Well, that's where some wood shavings or sawdust or something like that can help introduce those carbon-rich materials to help to provide what you need for your carbon needs. So different people and different sort of living situations are going to be looking for different sorts of materials. I did populate in chat. It's going to be all the way up at the top. Actually, Sean, or I can do it at the end as well. We do have a nice fact sheet through USU. It's called Backyard Composting in Utah. It's going to give you some of these numbers to help you to maybe have that really accessible on hand. There's also a really, really nice troubleshooting guide, which we'll talk about troubleshooting here in just a minute, but you aren't probably going to remember all of these things after this presentation. And so that's a nice resource that you can go back and you can have that at your fingertips to know kind of what your targets are. Okay. All right, so compost pile contents, things that are okay. Leaves, grass clippings, although we talked, you really should be returning those to your lawn. There is kind of a debunked myth out there. It's been long debunked by science that if you return grass clippings to your lawn, it causes thatch buildup in your lawn. That's not the case. So don't have to worry about that. Okay, weeds without seeds or spreading structures, manures from plant-eating animals. We do not add manures from omnivores or carnivores. It can introduce some pathogens that we don't really want to have in our compost pile that you don't really want to be handling. And I would say kind of a special sort of just a pause and a note on manures, even of plant-eating animals. I think it's interesting, actually, Colorado State University Extension said that you have to show some caution. That says compost made with manure is questionable for use in food gardens due to newer strains of bacteria that cause foodborne illnesses. So if you are adding a lot of manures to your compost pile, maybe just have some consideration there in terms of handling of those products, and that the composting process is going to kill off a lot of those pathogens that we find in some of those materials, but it's probably not going to get everything, and especially not in your backyard compost pile with your kind of lower temperature ranges, 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit of kind of your max temperatures. You may not kill off all of the pathogens in some of those materials. So just something to think about. Coffee grounds, wood chips, sawdust, bark, stem, again, smaller pieces. Gardening from canning waste. Obviously, you want to be careful if there's any oil used or if there's a lot of salt for some reason that's being used in that canning waste. That's something you wouldn't want to add. Fruits and veggies, eggshells, things like that. Some things to avoid would be meats, bones, oils, grease, dairy. Those are all going to attract rodents, different things to your compost pile that you don't want. Large branches, we already talked about that, plastics or other synthetics, manures for meat-eating animals, weed seeds, spreading structures, diseased plant parts. Go ahead and get rid of anything diseased. Don't leave that in your compost pile. And colored shiny paper. And things like this, it's just a little common sense. You have this dried out ear of field corn. That's going to take forever to break down in a compost pile. So that's probably not a material that I would choose to add if I'm trying to have rapid compost. Add your microorganisms. Add an inch of soil for every 8 to 14 inches of organic material. You don't want to add too much soil because then it becomes kind of a management issue in your pile. The pile becomes very heavy, it's difficult to turn, that sort of thing. So just a little bit of soil, and by adding a little bit of soil, you are inoculating it with the bacteria that you need. Compost inoculant starters, activators are not necessary. We already talked about watering, so keeping your pile moist, kind of like a slightly wrung out sponge. Avoid too much water, soggy conditions. So again, there's that moist level you can see. You don't want to let the pile dry out too much, but you don't want it sort of soaking wet either. Probably the number one thing that is going to reduce your rate of decomposition in your compost pile is actually oxygen. So you do definitely want to be aerating your pile. Let's see, I had something here. Let me see if I can find it really quickly that I just was reading it this morning. I said, oh, that's interesting. That when oxygen levels fall below 5%, the aerobes die and decomposition slows by as much as 90%. So you really do want to make sure that you're turning at least once a week for that rapid decomposition. Okay, so you wait for the temperature to heat up. We already talked about this. 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit kills pathogenic organisms and weed seeds. As the composting process finishes, temperatures will gradually drop. Composting is slow in cold temperatures, although the pile may still steam. Some people do cover their piles with a tarp. In the winter time. Also, sometimes people that are trying to compost in full sun will cover their piles as well for to help to retain a little bit more moisture in the piles so they don't have to water quite as often. But like I said, composting, active composting, hot composting is really best in the summer months. It's the quickest in the summer months, I should say. So you are turning your pile. Once a week is ideal. Mixing facilitates even decomposition throughout the pile and prevents overheating. Your backyard compost pile is not going to catch on fire. Okay, you really have to have very large pile sizes for that to be of concern. But you do want to make sure that you are turning your pile, and the best decomposition, the most rapid, the highest temperatures are occurring right in the center of the pile. So you want to make sure that all the contents within your pile has a chance to be in that center part of the pile so that they can really decompose rapidly and uniformly for you. And that final stage is the curing stage. So after our temperatures have started to decrease and composting is concluding, we leave the compost undisturbed for about a month to allow the chemical decomposition to stabilize. The curing concludes the composting process and avoids plant damage. Compost should be uniform with unidentifiable contents. It might be slightly hot, but it should not be uncomfortably hot. It should smell earthy, shouldn't be slimy or odorous. You shouldn't see any recognizable plant parts. And from what you start out with, the amount of material that you have once the compost has finished and is ready to be cured should be about half the size of what you originally started out with. And the compost process should conclude in 2 to 3 months, depending on how well you are managing that pile in the time of year. Okay, so I talked about that fact sheet, backyard composting in Utah. That's a USU fact sheet. It's got a really nice troubleshooting guide at the end. It's okay if you're having some problems with your compost pile because it's fixable. And so here are some of the symptoms and the solutions. Your pile won't heat up. You might have too much carbon. You need to add some nitrogen. Pile might be too small or dry. If it's stinky, the pile might be compacted. It might be too wet. There might be too much nitrogen there. It's attracting rodents. You're adding some things that you shouldn't be adding. Some people say, do compost piles stink? And usually the answer is no. However, sometimes they do have some odor associated with them. One thing I actually recommend is that when you're adding new contents to your pile, that you bury those contents in the pile a little bit, and that can help with that because you don't want this kind of a scenario happening. And this is really only going to happen for you if you're adding things that you really shouldn't be adding. Eggs are, eggshells are okay to add, but if you are adding, eggs that have the yolk and the whites in them, then that is another thing that can attract some of these things. You want to avoid that. Okay, so you're always welcome to visit us online for more information, for access to a lot of these fact sheets and things and materials that I mentioned at garden.usu.edu. And we're at 10 o'clock, and I am available at this point in time to answer any questions that you may have.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie, for the presentation. If any of you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I do see one question right off the bat, though. Any suggestions for a man-made compost bin might be made of plastic or something like that?
Any suggestions of a man-made compost bin might be made of plastic. You could use a plastic compost. Considerations with different, let's talk about some different sort of bin styles, because that is a question that we do get a lot. Some people say, what about the tumblers? How do the tumblers work? Those are plastic bins. I have heard different levels of success with those. One of the issues with the tumblers is, especially if you get a smaller sized tumbler, is that you may not have the quantity of material needed to really get the compost process activated. So going with a larger size tumbler, the tumblers can be kind of expensive compared to some of these other sort of bin constructions, but some people have tumblers that work great for them. They're really easy to aerate, obviously, when you're just turning them. And I know another suggestion, if you don't want to do the expensive tumbler, sometimes people do a 55-gallon drum that they put holes, they poke holes in the sides of them, drill holes in the sides of them, and can kind of roll them around the yard is another way that you can do that, and you can get that aeration. And then there are kind of the top loading plastic bins where you're adding your raw materials on the top, and then you get your finished compost coming out the bottom. The only issue with those is that they're really difficult to aerate. And so again, if you're trying to do hot composting or active composting, then those can be kind of tricky. You can do wood-sided bins. If you are, I would recommend that you go with a type of wood that's naturally rot resistant, like cedar or redwood in the construction of that. Some people use cinder blocks. Some people use straw. Some people use wire, and then they will tie it together. So if you use hooks or twists or things like that too with a wire bin, that can be kind of nice because you could unhook it or untwist it, take the wire off the outside, and then move it over, and then empty your contents that you had in your bin into your new bin, if that makes sense. So you can do wire. So there are a lot of different sort of bin types. And if there are other questions with that, or if people have suggestions of things that have worked well for them, feel free to let us know about that too. But hopefully that helps answer that question.
Perfect. Next question. How often do you add the compost to your garden?
Well, so kind of going back to what we were talking about in the beginning of the presentation, we recommend if you're trying to build organic matter levels in your garden soil, you're adding 2 to 4 inches. You may not have that from your backyard compost pile, so you may have to supplement that with some purchased compost to do that. But if you haven't worked the area before, you're trying to increase those organic matter levels, 2 to 4 inches, and then about 1 inch annually is 1 to 2 inches annually is what we recommend just to maintain those organic matter levels.
All right. Looks like someone has enough land to do the trench composting. Can you offer maybe some more advice or even cautions about trench composting?
I don't have the land to do trench composting. And so I don't personally do it myself. And maybe some of the participants have, or Sean, maybe you have. I would just caution, just really be careful you're not putting anything like meats, oils, grease, or anything like that that different rodents or animals might find attractive. Also, I wouldn't recommend putting in, if you're putting like fertilizer in, anything stinky like fish emulsion or something like that. I know sometimes I've heard gardeners, actually I've had this happen before too, where dogs have been digging in my yard because I used a fish emulsion and they could smell it and were interested in it. So I would caution that. But other than that, I think that the trench composting can work really well. Again, if you have that sacrificial space, you just have to realize it's going to take a lot longer for those materials to break down. So you're want to give it 6 months, and that's over the summertime. Really, probably about a year that those things need to be buried. That's part of the reason why I don't recommend people putting raw materials in their garden soil and just turning them in. Go ahead and compost them first, and then add them to your garden soil. So you're not in a position where where you have a lot of like half broken down stuff while you're trying to plant your garden plants. Also, you may just need to use a little bit of logic. If you're really trench composting mostly carbon-rich materials, it's probably going to take a lot longer unless you can offset the carbon-rich with some nitrogen. So just some of those types of considerations. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Yeah, it sounds good. This next question has to do with the brown versus the green and adding it to a pile. They're saying that it's super easy to get enough brown material in the fall with all the dried leaves.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time finding enough brown materials during the spring and the summer to balance out my kitchen waste. Any thoughts along those lines, Katie, to help out that situation?
Well, I would say, if you could have your raw material pile, you're really loading that raw material bin or pile or whatever it is for you up with your mulched leaves in the fall time. You can kind of use those as your round material that you need to be kind of combining with your kitchen scraps during the summer months, if that kind of makes sense. I do have master gardeners too that will ask neighbors for for their leaves because they have a similar situation where they're doing so much composting that they kind of run out of the browns. And so perhaps you could if you are in a situation where you don't have enough leaves, and you could get leaves from other people in the fall time too. But otherwise it's going to be some of those same materials that we talked about, acquisitions of those, of the wood shavings, or some of those types of things, depending on where you can find those. So, and people are always getting stuff chopped down and chopped up. So a lot of times if you are vigilant, just kind of ask around with your neighbors and that sort of a thing, you can find those materials. So hopefully that helps answer that question. One cautionary note though, one plant not to acquire leaves from and try to compost is black walnut. The black walnut plant parts have what's called allelopathy associated with them, and they will inhibit plant growth of plants that are trying to grow around them. And so if you do have a black walnut tree that get the leaves, the walnuts, the twigs, everything a part of that tree, you want to make sure that you just go ahead and throw that away or give that to the green waste. Don't try to compost those materials.
Sounds good. I'm almost wondering, with cutting down ornamental grasses in the springtime, I wonder if that could be a source of more of the brownish type material.
Yeah. Yep. I think so. And again, if you could just kind of try to chop those grasses up into smaller pieces or mulch them, then I think that would be a good, because you're kind of doing that anyway in the spring. A lot of people try to cut back their ornamental grasses in the fall, and if the grass is flopping over in winter snow events and things like that is not a concern. Sometimes they're right next to driveways or sidewalks or things, and so you kind of need to cut them back so that they don't become walking or driving hazards or that sort of a thing. But if they're positioned in the landscape where you don't need to cut them back in the fall time, wait and do it in the spring and then use that material in your compost. I think that's a great idea.
Cool. A few more questions here. Any tips on how to store kitchen scraps while accumulating enough to start a compost pile?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's why you want to, however you end up doing it, you want to somehow build a raw material bin or raw material pile. And that's really how you're gathering those materials together until you have enough, and then you can do your active composting. And you need to think about maybe what you have abundance of, or how you can acquire abundance from other places. It could be that composting is not really a great option for you if you're an apartment dweller and you have a few, kitchen scraps, and you just really don't have a lot of other materials. You don't really have a really good place to put those raw materials to build those to that 3x3x3 by 5x5x5. Another alternative option for folks like that might be to do some vermicomposting with those kitchen scraps. So there are other ways that you can deal with those materials. But if you're actively thinking about how you're going to acquire those materials, there should be options for you if you have the space. And again, like I said before, sometimes maybe you don't have a lot of raw materials yourself, then maybe you're thinking about building out your bin in the fall time, and you're asking your neighbors if you're able to take their leaves and mulch them to help build up or bulk up your compost pile. Or like Sean's suggestion that you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to cut back my grasses in the springtime, and that will be a good chunk of the materials I want to incorporate into my pile to help get that size to where it needs to be for that active composting. Hopefully that makes sense. Sean, I don't know if you have any other suggestions. I mean, you guys do a lot of composting out at the Conservation Garden Park, and so do you have any other thoughts or ideas in terms of how they can get those raw materials they need?
No, I think like you were just saying, just knowing that you'll have certain items at certain times of the year. So you'll have the leaves in the fall. And a lot of times at the garden, we still have leaves laying on the ground in the springtime too, because we don't have time to get to all of them in the fall. Although sometimes we just leave some of the leaves in the planting beds. They'll break down eventually, which will be good for those planting beds. But then, yeah, that's one thing we've been doing is with some of the ornamental grasses, we have used that as brown material in the past. So,
Right. Yeah, hopefully that helps. You do need to think about how you're going to acquire what you're going to put in your compost bin. And once you've kind of identified that, then you can sort of actively be working towards getting what you need to start the process.
okay, maybe one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Can you add new items to your pile while hot composting?
You can, at risk that you might not have as even of breakdown of materials. And I think that's probably kind of obvious. So sorry to give you the obvious answer, but it kind of is what it is. It's if your material is mostly broken down, it's almost reached the curing stage, then it's probably not a great time to be adding a lot of raw materials, especially carbon-rich materials that are probably going to take longer to break down for you, or big chunks of things or that sort of thing. You can if it's maybe the pile is just kind of starting to heat up. Your mesophilic bacteria are kind of kicking in. You're in that 70 to 100 degree range. You haven't hit that thermophilic bacteria range yet of 120 to 140 degrees. You could add small amounts. But I mean, if you've reached the quantity of materials that you need to start your active composting process, why not be working towards those new materials? Why not have those in your raw pile so that you can be working towards getting the amount of material that you need built up so that you can start your next batch of compost after the one that you're actively composting is thoroughly broken down and is in the curing, or you've already added it to your garden soil, if that makes sense. So you're not only thinking about like how to build up that material amount where you're going to identify those sources, but as you're actively composting, you're working towards your next pile, and you're planning for that one, if that makes sense. So
That makes sense. One thing that I'd like to note is we generally at the garden, we try to not let organic material leave the site, but at the same time, we have so much organic material. And I guess this could be the case in someone's own landscape too, that it's okay to send some of it to the green waste facility at the landfill, because then they'll turn it into compost typically. So that is an option if you have too much material.
I do want to make just sort of a special note too. Usually, maybe we don't have anybody in this class that has backyard chickens, but usually we get some backyard chicken questions. And can you use the chicken manure and the shavings that I put cedar shavings. I have 2 chickens. And I clean out their coop in the springtime. And I put the wood shavings, their bedding material, and then also their waste from over the winter months in my compost pile. That's the way actually I'm adding browns that way with the wood shavings, the cedar shavings, but I'm also adding the manure as well. But you know, one consideration with manures is that they can be kind of high in salts as well. So that's okay if you're thoroughly composting or breaking down that material. But that would be maybe a material that you certainly wouldn't want to add directly to your garden soil. You'd want to make sure that that material was thoroughly composted or broken down. Another one, sometimes I get questions on that nobody asked this time, but maybe is a little bit of special consideration, is you will read books or you will see sites that say that you can add your wood ashes from burning wood to your compost pile. We actually don't suggest that here in the Intermountain West. And the reason why is because wood ashes tend to be high in alkalinity, and our soils are high naturally in pH. And so we don't really want to increase the pH of our soils, and they can be really high in salts as well. And just our conditions here in the Intermountain West, sometimes soluble salts are something that we're actively trying to manage in our garden soils. And so we don't really want to be adding additional salts to our garden soils. And so wood ashes is another one that, like Sean said, sometimes it's really okay to give it to the green waste. And or if you don't have that, to throw it away. We try to do everything we can to recycle things, but some things it's really best to just go ahead and get rid of.
I agree. Last question we'll end on, and I don't think we've talked about this yet, but what about pine needles?
Yeah.
Can those be put into the compost bin?
You can. They're going to take a really long time to break down. Things that are resinous too are just going to take a really long time to break down. So if you did try to compost pine needles, you definitely would want to chop them up. But you know, Sean's suggestion earlier, say you have a lot of pine needles and you really do want to compost them, but you don't want to wait forever and a moon. Maybe you have a pine needle compost pile that you're actively composting, and you're adding nitrogen because you know that they're really high in carbon. They're going to take a lot longer to break down. They will eventually break down. Otherwise, if you don't have that patience, then consider putting those in the yard waste bin. So yeah, it's not like they won't, they're just going to take a lot longer. And so that's a decision that you need to make in terms of, you know, what your time expectation is to have your finished compost. Sean, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I would also say that a lot of times we'll just use the pine needles as mulch.
Yeah.
So if the pine tree is in a planting bed, a lot of times we'll just let the pine needles lie on the ground and we'll just use it as the mulch in the area. They do that a lot in the southern United States. Lots of pine trees down there, they just let them lay on the ground. So, and it actually works as a pretty good mulch.
Yeah, I agree with that. It always kind of makes me laugh sometimes, and certainly I understand why, because I do the same thing. But When we look at organic matter levels in soils, we always see much higher organic matter levels in soils in, for example, mountainous regions. And people kind of wonder, well, why is that? And part of it might be moisture conditions and some of those sorts of things, but nobody's out raking the forest floor, picking up sticks, all of those sorts of things. But we do a great job sometimes in our urban landscapes of raking up and discarding all of our organic matter material. And then in the springtime, we go buy it back and haul it back to our landscapes. So composting is a way in which you can keep those organic matter materials in the yard and landscape and reapply those to our garden soils. So just something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything that just falls on the ground naturally, like pine needles that can be used as mulch. I mean, it's the easiest type of mulch to have in your landscape. You don't have to do anything with it.
Yeah, and if you have grass growing right where those pine needles are, then just run those pine needles over with a mulchy mower and it's going to chop them up into little pieces. It's going to help speed up that process for you. Remember that same bacteria that we're putting in our compost piles is found in our garden soils. And so it's a slower decomposition rate in the garden soils, but it's happening there too. And it helps to build those organic matter levels. Frankly, and helps to build drought resiliency in your turf grass stands as well. And so it's just a good management decision sometimes to keep those materials in place if they can be handled and don't become problematic in terms of their accumulation.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Well, thanks again for the presentation, Katie. Lots of great information. Hopefully all of you feel empowered now to go make your own compost pile, reuse the green materials and brown materials in your landscape. I hope to see all of you out at the garden soon. We're open this time of year, Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. And then in May, we go to our summer hours, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Saturday. So hope to see you at the garden soon. Thanks again, Katie, and I hope all of you have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.